For most of human history, bread wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a necessity of life. You could not survive without it. It was the main energy source for people, and in many ways, it still is today. You ate bread because you needed energy that actually lasted. You see, when people settled down around 10,000 BCE, bread didn't appear because it was fashionable, it appeared because it was needed. Once humans began farming, grain became the most reliable option available. Grain meant portable calories. Bread meant fuel you could store, ration, and trust when food wasn't guaranteed. And frankly speaking, it was the most accessible food out there. Now, if we talk about that bread, it wasn't soft. It wasn't fast. And it definitely wasn't light. It was dense enough that a single piece could carry an entire meal. Fermentation took time, sometimes days, so energy was released slowly instead of crashing an hour later. That wasn't accidental. People worked all day with their bodies, often without knowing when they'd eat next. Bread had to hold. But somewhere along the way, that design broke. Here's the thing about modern bread. It's built for speed, volume, and shelf life. Flour is stripped down. Fermentation is rushed. Texture is engineered to disappear the moment it hits your mouth. And I don't know about you, but to me, modern bread also tastes kind of bland. It still looks like bread. It still tastes like bread. But inside your body, it behaves very differently. If you've ever felt hungry again an hour later, foggy, bloated, or worse after eating what should have been basic fuel, that's not you. That's the mismatch. So here's the real question. If modern bread no longer works like the food humans relied on for thousands of years, what happens when you remove flour entirely? What happens when bread is rebuilt around something the modern system mostly ignored: lentils? Now, I'm not saying throw out all the bread from your fridge or wherever you keep it, but lentils are different. They don't spike blood sugar. They carry real protein. They digest slowly, with their structure intact. They were never flashy, but they were always reliable. And that's exactly why they matter now. You see, bread sits in the modern diet so quietly that most people don't even notice it anymore. It doesn't feel like a choice. It's just there. Toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch, a roll on the side at dinner. And in between, it shows up as filler, something you grab without thinking because the meal feels incomplete without it. Now, once I actually paid attention to this, I couldn't unsee it. Supermarkets devote entire walls to bread. Fast food menus default to it. Meal kits assume it. Most kitchens stock it without ever stopping to ask why. And this isn't subtle. Roughly 3/4 of people globally bought bread or bread products in the last year. In the US, it's basically universal. Over 98% of people eat bread in some form. True non-consumers are rare, statistically almost invisible. And that assumption gives bread a weird status. You see, it's not treated like junk food. It's not marketed like candy or questioned like soda. Nobody side-eyes bread the way they do sugar drinks. It's framed as neutral, harmless, just a basic building block. Cheap, pre-sliced, shelf-stable, portable, ready to eat without effort or skill, convenience is the selling point. But here's the thing. Neutral isn't the same as harmless. Most modern bread lives inside a heavily processed food system built for softness, shelf life, and consistency, not nourishment. Additives keep it fresh longer. Dough conditioners standardize texture. Refining strips out the fiber and micronutrients that slow digestion. What you're left with is a product designed to move fast from factory to shelf to mouth. But in my opinion, food that moves that fast usually leaves just as fast. Now, how big of a deal is that? Bigger than it sounds. In the US, over half of adult calories come from ultra-processed foods. For kids, it's even higher. Commercial breads and baked goods make up a solid chunk of that, not because people binge them like desserts, but because they eat them constantly. And this is where familiarity becomes a problem. When you eat something every day, you stop questioning it. Bread feels safe because it's always been there. It's just bread, and that's apparently the end of the investigation. People read labels on protein bars. They argue about sugar in soda. But bread? Oh no, that couldn't possibly be worth asking questions about. I didn't either for a long time. Even with trends like low-carb, keto, or gluten-free floating around, bread consumption hasn't collapsed. The average person in the US still eats somewhere between 17 and 24 kilos of bread a year. And ironically, bread still supplies a chunk of daily fiber intake for many people, even when that fiber comes from refined sources that don't do much physiologically. That's the contradiction, and it's easy to miss because it hides in plain sight. Bread feels foundational, so it escapes evaluation. It feels normal, so it avoids blame. And because it's eaten in small amounts, spread across the day, its effects rarely get traced back to the source. But once you stop treating bread as neutral and start seeing it as a system built around speed and convenience, the question changes. Now, it's not, does bread belong in the modern diet by default? It's, does the kind of bread most people eat today still behave like the food they think it is? And that's where things start to get interesting. At first glance, lentil bread looks like another modern workaround. It shows up in recipe feeds, gluten-free blogs, and high-protein food spaces, usually framed as a substitute, something you eat instead of real bread, when bread stops agreeing with you. That framing makes it easy to dismiss as niche, temporary, or trend-driven. But lentil bread isn't a single product, and it isn't trying to imitate supermarket white bread. There are two main forms it takes. The first is the flourless version. This is the one most people encounter online. Dried lentils, often red lentils, soaked, rinsed, blended with water, and baked with minimal binders. Psyllium husk, eggs, yogurt, flax, or a small amount of baking powder are commonly used to give structure. There's no wheat flour, no yeast, no kneading. The result is naturally gluten-free, grain-free, and structurally different from conventional bread. The second is the hybrid version. In these recipes, lentil flour replaces roughly 20 to 30% of wheat flour in a traditional dough. The goal isn't elimination, but reinforcement, adding fiber, protein, and micronutrients to a familiar form without abandoning it entirely. Both exist for a reason, but the flourless form is where lentil bread becomes something else altogether, not just nutritionally adjusted, but mechanically different. Red lentils dominate these recipes for practical reasons. When soaked and blended, they lose their sharp, raw flavor and bake into something mild, neutral, and slightly nutty. They require no fermentation, no specialized equipment, and no advanced baking skill. From a systems perspective, they're unusually accessible, shelf-stable, inexpensive, globally available, and easy to make at home. The texture tells you immediately what kind of food this is. Lentil bread isn't airy. It doesn't collapse when squeezed. It has a crusted exterior and a dense, soft interior, closer to an artisan whole grain roll or a hearty, savory loaf than anything sliced and bagged. It smells toasted and earthy, not sweet. And that difference matters, because texture isn't cosmetic. It's a signal of how a food behaves once you eat it. This is the point where lentil bread stops being a recipe trend and starts becoming a physiological question. And that's where the research begins. What if I told you there's an alternative solution and it's not as modern or trendy as it looks? And that alternative is lentil bread. Yes, you heard that right. I know how that sounds at first. Lentil bread doesn't exactly scream exciting. It sounds like something you'd scroll past on a recipe feed and never think about again. But stay with me for a second, because this isn't about replacing bread just for the sake of it. And honestly, that framing makes it easy to dismiss. It sounds niche, temporary, trend-driven, like something people try for 2 weeks and forget about. But here's the thing. Lentil bread isn't one single product, and it's not really trying to imitate supermarket white bread in the first place. There are actually two main ways it shows up. The first is the flourless version, and this is the one most people stumble across online. Dried lentils, usually red lentils, get soaked, rinsed, blended with water, and baked. That's basically it. Sometimes people add psyllium husk, eggs, yogurt, flax, or a little baking powder just to help it hold together. No wheat flour, no yeast, no kneading. So what do you end up with? Something that's naturally gluten-free, grain-free, and structurally very different from normal bread. The second version is more of a hybrid. In those recipes, lentil flour replaces about 20 to 30% of the wheat flour in a traditional dough. The goal isn't to eliminate bread, it's to reinforce it. Add fiber, add protein, add nutrients, but still keep the familiar shape and feel. Both versions exist for a reason. But if I'm being honest, the flourless version is where things really change. That's where lentil bread stops being a tweak and starts becoming something else entirely. Now, why lentils, especially red lentils? Mostly because they're practical. When you soak and blend them, the harsh raw flavor disappears. They bake into something mild, neutral, slightly nutty, no fermentation, no fancy tools. No baking background required. From a systems point of view, they're almost too convenient, shelf-stable, cheap, available almost everywhere, and easy to make at home. And the texture tells you immediately what kind of food this is. Lentil bread isn't airy. It doesn't collapse when you squeeze it. You can't accidentally crush it into nothing with one hand. It has a crusted outside and a dense, soft inside closer to a hearty, whole-grain loaf than anything sliced and bagged. It smells toasted and earthy, not sweet. You see, it actually feels like food. Now, that difference matters. Because texture isn't just cosmetic. It's not about looks or vibes. It's a signal. It tells you how a food is going to behave once you eat it, whether it sticks around or disappears on you an hour later. And this is where lentil bread stops being a recipe trend and starts becoming an actual physiological question. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear, this is just a rough overview. I'm not pretending this is the definitive way to make lentil bread, or even the best one. You see, there are dozens of variations out there, different ratios, different binders, different baking times. And honestly, I'm sure you can find recipes online that are more detailed, more optimized, and probably better tested than anything I could walk you through here. That's not really the point. The point is to understand what kind of food this is, how it's built, and why it behaves differently once you eat it. The exact recipe can vary. The structure, that's what matters. So think of this as a framework, not instructions. A way to see what's happening under the hood before worrying about the fine details. You see, lentil bread isn't really rooted in tradition. It's rooted in constraints. It exists because modern life comes with limits, limited time, limited patience for ultra-processed food, and a growing need for meals that actually work without demanding skill, equipment, or hours in the kitchen. So in that sense, lentil bread isn't some romantic return to the past. It's more like practical design. Now, when you look at the system from start to finish, it's almost boringly simple, and I mean that in a good way. Most versions only require tools people already have, a blender or food processor, an oven, and a loaf pan. Active prep time is short, usually 5 to 10 minutes. The rest just happens in the background while you do something else. Ingredient cost is low too. Dry red lentils run about $1 to $2 per pound, so a full loaf usually costs $1 or $2, depending on what you add. And honestly, once I noticed that, it made modern store-bought bread feel kind of over-engineered. Because when you compare the two, commercial bread relies on industrial milling, dough conditioners, preservatives, and tightly controlled timelines just to function. Lentil bread skips all of that and scales the whole thing down to something you can do at home without thinking too hard. So how does it actually work? It starts with soaking. Alright, let me walk you through this because it's simpler than it sounds. You start with dry red lentils, usually 1 or 2 cups. Rinse them, cover them with water, and then you just let them sit. Over a few hours, they swell to about double their size. And no, this doesn't cook them. You see, it just softens them. It washes off surface starch, makes blending easier, and from what most people notice, it makes the final bread much easier to digest. For most people, this part happens overnight, and honestly, that's why the system works. You set it up in the evening, forget about it, go to sleep, and deal with it the next day. Sure, there are faster methods, but this passive soak is what makes it sustainable long-term. No effort, no babysitting. Now comes blending. You drain the lentils, toss them into a blender with water, a pinch of salt, and a little fat olive oil or avocado oil both work great here. Blend for a minute or two, and you're done. You get a smooth batter. High-speed blenders make this almost laughably easy now. What used to require grinding or cooking is basically one button press. And this is the moment where things change. This is where lentils stop behaving like beans and start behaving like dough. Now, binding this is where structure is decided, so pay attention here. You add your binders, eggs, yogurt, or a flax substitute if you're keeping it plant-based. Psyllium husk usually comes in here too. Once it hydrates, it forms a gel that does a surprisingly good job mimicking gluten while also boosting fiber. Give it 5 to 10 minutes, and you'll actually see the batter thicken. It starts holding its shape. That's how you know you're on the right track. A small amount of baking powder or baking soda gives you lift. And that's it. No yeast, no rising time, no kneading. You're not waiting around for anything to happen. Structure comes from hydration and binding, not fermentation, which, frankly speaking, is why people who don't like baking still end up loving this. Finally, it gets baked. You pour the batter into a lined pan, slide it into the oven, and let the heat do the rest. No drama, no timing, anxiety. Just a simple system doing what it's designed to do. Between 2024 and 2025, lentil bread recipes exploded online. Not because people were chasing tradition or authenticity, but because they wanted steady energy, fewer crashes, better satiety, and bread-like food that didn't mess with the rest of their diet. That's what makes lentil bread a modern system. It keeps the function of bread slices, toast, sandwiches, but removes the industrial layers that now define most commercial loaves. And honestly, that's what got my attention. I didn't want a replacement, I just wanted something that worked the same way without the side effects. It fits. Now, modern food systems flipped that logic. Convenience became the goal. Yield replaced resilience, time was compressed, and digestion was expected to adapt. It didn't. Long-term metabolic health doesn't come from shortcuts. It comes from systems that reduce stress on the body rather than masking it. Systems that align with digestion instead of overriding it. So when you choose bread or any food, you're not just choosing calories. You're choosing a system. And the systems we choose determine whether the body merely gets by or stays resilient.